For 12 years, I sent my mother $1,450 every single month. 12 years of skipped vacations, secondhand furniture, and dreams put on hold, all for a house she promised would be mine. Then she stood in front of our entire family and gave it to my sister as a graduation gift. I still remember the sound of my own heartbeat drowning out the applause. The way my mother smiled at Emily like she'd just handed her the world. The way 15 relatives stared at their plates when I reminded everyone I'd been paying for that house since I was 24 years old. My mother's response, "The deed is in my name, you don't have any paperwork." Then she added with the same mouth that once promised me everything, "And you're not invited to the graduation party." The room went silent. My hands were trembling. But I didn't cry. I turned to my aunt and asked quietly, "Do you want to tell them, or should I?" 3 days later, my sister's celebration turned into something no one saw coming. Have you ever discovered that your family saw you as nothing more than a bank account? My name is Jamie Andrews. I'm 36 years old, a project coordinator at a logistics company in Columbus, Ohio. For most of my adult life, I believed that hard work and loyalty would eventually be rewarded, especially when it came to family. I was wrong. Growing up, I was always the responsible one. The older sister who babysat without being asked, who got a part-time job at 16 to help with groceries, who never complained when my younger sister Emily got new clothes while I wore hand-me-downs. My father used to call me his little rock. He said I was the steady one, the one he could count on. I held on to those words like treasure. Then he died when I was 16, and everything changed. My mother transformed overnight. She wrapped herself around Emily like a protective shell, shielding her from every hardship, real or imagined. But with me, something shifted. The warmth I once felt from her faded into something cold and distant. I thought it was grief. I thought she just needed time. I spent years trying to earn back her approval, straight A's, a college scholarship, a stable career. Nothing worked. No matter what I achieved, my mother looked at me like I was a stranger. Sometimes like I was an enemy. I didn't understand why until much later. Years after my father's death, my mother found my old teenage diary while cleaning out boxes. In it, I had written about the night I accidentally discovered Dad's secret, his gambling problem, the hidden debts, his tearful plea for me to stay quiet. I was 16 years old, terrified and confused, trying to protect a father I adored. My mother never confronted me about what she read. She simply decided in the silence of her own heart that I was complicit in my father's betrayal. I became the living reminder of the man who had lied to her, and she made me pay for his sins. When I was 24, my mother approached me with an opportunity. She wanted to buy a house, but couldn't qualify for the mortgage on her own. Would I help? The arrangement seemed simple. I would send her $1,450 each month. She would pay the mortgage, and when it was paid off, she would transfer the deed to me. "Family doesn't need contracts," she said with a warm smile. "I promise this house will be yours." I believed her. I wanted so desperately to believe that this was her way of rebuilding our bond. So I agreed. Every single month for 12 years, I sent that money without fail. I skipped vacations, I drove used cars, I put my own dreams on hold, all for a house that was supposed to be my future. Then came the foreclosure notice. 7 years into our arrangement, I arrived for a surprise visit and found a sheriff's notice taped to the front door. Auction in 30 days. I confronted my mother, and she collapsed into tears. "Medical bills," she sobbed. "Unexpected expenses. I fell behind. I emptied my savings, $38,000 to save the house." She clutched my hands and swore through her tears, "This house is yours. I will never forget what you did." But even as I held her, a small voice whispered in my mind, "Where did all my money actually go?" After that crisis, my Aunt Maureen pulled me aside. "Keep every bank statement," she said quietly, "every receipt. Protect yourself." I thought she was being paranoid, but I listened. For 7 years, I saved every record filed away in a folder I hoped I would never need. And recently, I noticed my mother growing anxious, checking her phone constantly, taking hushed calls behind closed doors. Once I overheard her say, "I need more time, you'll get your money." She hung up the moment she saw me watching. For 12 years, I told myself I was building a future. I didn't realize I was funding my mother's secrets. And those phone calls she kept hiding were about to destroy everything I thought I knew about my family. 3 weeks before my sister's MBA graduation, my mother called a family gathering. She said she had a special announcement to make something to celebrate Emily's achievement. I almost didn't go. After years of feeling like an outsider in my own family, these events had become exhausting. But some stubborn part of me still hoped that showing up being present might finally matter. So I drove to the house I had been paying for since I was 24 years old, parked in the driveway, and walked through the front door with a smile I didn't feel. About 15 relatives had gathered in the living room. Aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't seen in months. The mood was warm and celebratory. Emily had done something impressive, earning her MBA from a respected program, and everyone wanted to congratulate her. I hugged my sister and told her I was proud of her. She smiled and thanked me, but there was something uncertain in her eyes, like she was waiting for something she didn't quite understand. My mother stood at the center of attention, accepting compliments on raising such a successful daughter. But as I watched her move through the room, I noticed things that troubled me. She looked thinner than the last time I had seen her, almost gaunt. Her smile seemed stretched too tight across her face, and she kept checking her phone, excusing herself every few minutes for what she called quick work calls. During one of these calls, I stepped into the kitchen to refill my drink and heard her voice drifting through the window. She was standing on the back porch, speaking in a tone I had never heard before. Desperate, almost pleading. I caught fragments of the conversation. 60 days isn't enough. I'm working on it. You'll get what I owe you. Then silence. When she came back inside, her smile was bright again, but her hands were shaking slightly as she smoothed down her blouse. After dinner, my mother stood up and tapped her glass with a spoon. The room fell quiet. She looked around at everyone with an expression of pride and announced that she had wonderful news. As a graduation gift to Emily, she had decided to give her this house. She gestured around the living room like she was presenting a prize on a game show. Emily's face went pale with shock. She clearly had not expected this. My mother beamed at her and said she deserved a strong foundation for her future. I felt the floor shift beneath me. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. 12 years of payments, 12 years of sacrifice, 12 years of believing that this house would be mine. I heard my own voice speaking before I fully realized I was talking. Mom, I said, keeping my tone as steady as I could manage, I've been sending you money for the mortgage for 12 years. The room went silent. Every relative turned to look at me, then at my mother. Linda's expression changed in an instant. The warmth vanished, replaced by something hard and cold. You were helping with household expenses, she said flatly. That's what family does. I tried again. You promised me this house would be mine. You said when the mortgage was paid off, you would transfer the deed. My mother's voice turned sharp. The deed is in my name, Jamie. You don't have any legal claim to this house. She paused, and when she spoke again, her words cut deeper than anything she had ever said to me. And frankly, I think it's best if you don't come to the graduation party. We don't need your negativity ruining Emily's special day. 15 relatives sat in absolute silence. No one spoke up. No one defended me. I looked around the room at people I had known my entire life, people who had watched me grow up, and not a single one of them said a word. I turned to Emily, hoping for something, anything. My sister stared at her plate, her face pale, her lips pressed together. She didn't look at me. She didn't speak. The silence was its own kind of answer. I left without saying goodbye. I drove back to my apartment in a daze, replaying the scene over and over in my mind. The coldness in my mother's eyes, the silence of my relatives, Emily's refusal to even look at me. I had spent my whole life trying to be good enough for this family, and in one moment my mother had made it clear that I never would be. That night there was a knock on my door. It was Aunt Maureen. She looked tired and sad, and she asked if she could come in. I let her sit on my couch and made us both tea, though neither of us touched it. There's something you need to know, she said quietly, something your mother has never told you. I waited. Maureen took a deep breath and told me a story that changed everything I thought I understood about my family. After my father died, my mother had found my teenage diary while cleaning out old boxes. She read an entry I had written when I was 16 about the night I accidentally discovered Dad's gambling problem. I had written about his tears, his desperate plea for me to keep his secret, my confusion about what to do. My mother read those words and felt doubly betrayed. First by her husband, who had hidden a gambling addiction from her for years, then by me, her own daughter, who had known the truth and said nothing. In her mind, I was my father's accomplice. I had chosen him over her, and she had punished me for it ever since. I sat in stunned silence as the pieces fell into place. 20 years of coldness, 20 years of impossible standards and constant disappointment. 20 years of watching my mother pour love into Emily while treating me like a stranger. It all made sense now. I was 16, I whispered. I didn't know what to do. I know, Maureen said gently. But your mother needed someone to blame. Your father was dead. You were still here. You were easier to punish than a ghost. For a long moment, I just sat there, letting the weight of this revelation settle over me. Part of me wanted to cry. Part of me wanted to scream. But as the initial shock faded, something else began to stir. My analytical mind, the part of me that solved problems for a living, started asking questions. The resentment explained the emotional distance. It explained the favoritism and the cruelty. But it didn't explain the urgency. Why transfer the house now after all these years? Why was my mother so desperate during those phone calls? Why the sudden need to exclude me completely from the family? I stood up and walked to my closet. From the top shelf, I pulled down a thick folder. 7 years of bank statements, payment records, receipts for every dollar I had sent my mother. I spread them across my kitchen table and looked at Aunt Maureen. I think there's more going on here, I said slowly. Something about money. Something Mom is trying to hide. Maureen was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. I've suspected for years that Linda has a problem. The same problem your father had. But I could never prove it, and I couldn't accuse my own sister without evidence. I looked at the documents spread before me. Then let's find evidence, I said. I thought I finally understood why my mother hated me. But as I dug deeper into those records, I realized the truth was far worse than old resentments. My mother didn't just want to punish me for keeping my father's secret. She needed me gone because I was the only one who might expose what she was really doing. The week after that conversation with Aunt Maureen, I did something I should have done years ago. I stopped trusting and started investigating. I called a real estate attorney named Patricia Hernandez, recommended by a colleague at work, and scheduled a consultation. I brought my folder of 7 years of bank statements, every receipt, every record of the money I had sent my mother. Patricia listened to my story without interrupting, then asked me a question that changed everything. She asked if I had ever verified that my payments were actually being applied to the mortgage. I hadn't. For 12 years, I had trusted my mother completely. Patricia explained that even though I wasn't on the mortgage as someone with a potential legal claim to the property, she could request certain records through proper legal channels. She filed the necessary paperwork, and within a few days, we had the mortgage payment history from the bank. What those documents revealed made me sick to my stomach. There was a pattern hidden in the numbers. Multiple months over the years, where I had sent my money on time, but the mortgage payment was late or missed entirely. The discrepancies added up to tens of thousands of dollars. My money had gone somewhere, but it hadn't always gone to the bank. Patricia asked me if I had any idea where those missing funds might have gone. I thought about the foreclosure crisis 7 years ago. I thought about my mother's desperate phone calls. I thought about what Aunt Maureen had said about my father's gambling problem. And I thought about the possibility that my mother had inherited more than just his debts. Then Patricia showed me something that confirmed my worst suspicions. She had pulled public records as part of her research and discovered a civil lawsuit filed against my mother by a creditor. The amount was $23,000 in unpaid debt. The court date was in 60 days. If the creditor won, they could place a lien on the house, which meant they could potentially force its sale to recover what they were owed. Patricia looked at me with serious eyes and explained what this meant. Your mother is trying to transfer the house to your sister. Before that judgment comes through, she said, she's attempting to move her only major asset out of her name so creditors can't touch it. That's called fraudulent transfer, and it's illegal. Everything clicked into place. The sudden urgency to give Emily the house, the desperate phone calls about needing more time, the determination to exclude me from the family gathering. My mother wasn't just punishing me for an old grudge. She was running a scheme, and I was the only person with enough documentation to expose it. Patricia helped me compile my evidence into a clear, organized package. 12 years of payment records totaling over $200,000. The $38,000 I had paid to save the house from foreclosure. Proof that mortgage payments had been missed or late despite my consistent contributions. Public records showing my mother's debt and the pending lawsuit. And a written statement from Aunt Maureen confirming the verbal promises my mother had made about transferring the deed to me. Patricia explained my legal options. I had a strong case for something called equitable interest, a legal doctrine that can grant ownership rights to someone who paid for a property even if their name isn't on the deed. But beyond my personal claim, the evidence suggested my mother was committing fraud. That was a serious matter with serious consequences. I thought about what to do next. Part of me wanted to drive to that house, walk through the front door, and confront my mother in front of everyone. But Patricia advised against it. Showing up uninvited could be considered trespassing, and any emotional confrontation could undermine my legal position. She suggested a smarter approach, something that would let the truth speak for itself. So instead of crashing my sister's graduation party, I sent letters. Certified letters to 8 key family members, including Aunt Maureen, Uncle Frank, and Aunt Dorothy, who I knew had loaned my mother $12,000 for car repairs that I suspected had never actually been made. The letters were calm and factual. No accusations, no emotional appeals, just documentation. I presented the payment records, explained the pending lawsuit, and raised concerns about the suspicious timing of the house transfer. Each letter was scheduled to arrive on the morning of the graduation party. I didn't attend the celebration. I didn't need to. The documents would speak for themselves. I learned what happened next from Aunt Maureen, who called me that evening with her voice shaking. She told me that the party had started normally enough. Relatives gathered, food was served. Congratulations were offered to Emily. Then my mother stood up to make her grand announcement about the house. But the atmosphere had already shifted. Relatives who had read my letter that morning exchanged uncomfortable glances. Before my mother could finish her speech, Aunt Dorothy stood up slowly. Her voice was quiet but firm. "Linda," she said, "I received something in the mail this morning." We all did. My mother's smile faltered. She tried to brush it off, claiming she didn't know what Dorothy was talking about. But Dorothy wasn't finished. 12 years, Linda," she said. "Your daughter sent you money for 12 years. And now I'm wondering about something. That $12,000 I loaned you for car repairs. Did you ever actually fix your car?" Then Uncle Frank spoke up. He reminded my mother that he had loaned her $8,000 for Emily's tuition years ago. "But Emily had scholarships," he said. "So where did my money actually go?" One by one, other relatives began voicing their questions, not shouting or accusing. Something worse. Calm, disappointed voices asking for answers that my mother couldn't give. The room watched as her carefully constructed world began to crumble. Emily stood frozen near the doorway, her face pale, her eyes moving between her mother and the relatives who were now demanding explanations. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was breaking. "Mom," she asked, "is any of this true?" My mother reached for her daughter desperately. "Emily, honey." "It's complicated," she started to say, but Emily pulled away. "Just answer me," she demanded. "Did Jamie really pay for this house? Did you lie to all of us?" My mother's silence was the only answer anyone needed. Aunt Maureen told me that Emily didn't storm out dramatically. She stood very still for a long moment, processing the destruction of everything she had believed about our family. Then she spoke in a hollow voice. "I can't accept this house," she said. "I won't be part of whatever this is." She turned to the room and quietly announced that the party was over. Then she walked to her childhood bedroom and closed the door behind her. That quiet click was somehow more devastating than any slammed door or shouted accusation could have been. My mother was left standing alone as relatives gathered their things and headed for the exit, avoiding her eyes. Aunt Dorothy stopped at the door on her way out. "I expect my money back, Linda," she said. "All of it." Then she was gone. When the last guest had left, my mother sank into a chair in her empty living room, surrounded by untouched food and celebration decorations that now seemed to mock her. Her scheme was exposed. Her family had turned away. Her youngest daughter had locked herself in her room. And somewhere across town, the creditors were still coming, their lawsuit still pending, their judgment still inevitable. My mother didn't just lose the house that day. She lost her reputation. She lost her family's trust. She lost both of her daughters. But the legal consequences, the ones that would follow her for years, were only beginning. The legal process moved slowly, but it moved. In the months following the graduation party, my attorney filed for mediation to resolve the property dispute. My mother hired her own lawyer, a tired-looking man who seemed to know from the start that his client had no real defense. The mediation took 4 months of meetings, document reviews, and negotiations. I presented my 12 years of bank statements, my payment records, my receipts. Every dollar I had ever sent was documented and accounted for. My mother couldn't dispute the numbers. She tried to argue that the money was for household expenses, for helping with bills for family support, but the records told a different story. Consistent monthly payments of $1,450, the exact amount of the mortgage sent without fail for over a decade. The mediator saw through her excuses. In the end, the ruling was clear. I had what the law calls equitable interest in the property. Even though my name was never on the deed, my substantial financial contributions gave me a legal claim to the house. The mediator ordered that the property be sold with the proceeds divided according to our respective contributions. After paying off the remaining mortgage balance and covering the closing costs, I received approximately $175,000. It was less than the $250,000 I had paid over the years. My attorney explained that some of my money had gone to interest payments, property taxes, and insurance, which don't build equity. It wasn't everything I deserved, but it was legally mine. For the first time in 12 years, I had something to show for all those sacrifices. But the house sale was only the beginning of my mother's problems. The creditor's lawsuit moved forward on its own timeline, completely separate from our family dispute. With evidence of her attempted fraudulent transfer, now part of the public record, my mother's legal position collapsed entirely. The creditor won their judgment easily, and once word spread through the family about what had really been happening, other relatives came forward. Aunt Dorothy demanded repayment of the $12,000 she had loaned for car repairs that never happened. Uncle Frank wanted his $8,000 back. Two other cousins revealed they had also given my mother money over the years for various emergencies that now seemed suspicious. The total amount she owed to family members alone exceeded $40,000. The county prosecutor's office took an interest in the case. 6 months after the graduation party, my mother was formally charged with theft by deception, a fourth-degree felony under Ohio law. I wasn't the one who pressed charges. I didn't have to. The pattern of fraud was so clear, involving so many victims, that the state decided to prosecute on its own. My mother's attorney negotiated a plea deal to avoid a trial that would have exposed even more of her deceptions. The sentence was 18 months of probation, 200 hours of community service, mandatory gambling addiction treatment, and a court order to pay restitution to me, Aunt Dorothy, and Uncle Frank. She avoided prison because she was a first-time offender and the crime was non-violent. But the felony conviction would follow her for the rest of her life. Every job application, every background check, every official form would carry the mark of what she had done. When she tried to escape her remaining debts by filing for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, the court denied her request. The evidence of fraud made her ineligible for a clean discharge. Instead, she was placed in Chapter 13, a 5-year payment plan that would consume most of her income for half a decade. She moved out of the house before it sold, settling into a small studio apartment on the other side of town. The home where she had raised 2 daughters, where she had orchestrated 12 years of deception, where she had stood and announced her plan to give away something that was never fully hers to give, was sold to strangers. I drove past it once a few weeks after the sale closed. There was a new family moving in, carrying boxes through the front door, children running across the lawn. A different life beginning in the space where mine had unraveled. 3 weeks after the graduation party, before the legal proceedings had fully concluded, Emily called me. Her voice was raw, like she had been crying for days. She told me she had been replaying our entire childhood in her mind. All those times our mother had called me difficult or selfish or ungrateful, Emily had believed her. She had never questioned it. She had watched me struggle for our mother's approval and assumed I must deserve the coldness I received. Now she understood the truth, and the shame was eating her alive. I was quiet for a moment, letting her words settle. Then I told her something I had been thinking about for weeks. "You were a child being manipulated by a parent," I said. "We both were. She just used us differently. You were the golden child. I was the ATM machine." Emily tried to protest, saying that wasn't an excuse. I agreed with her. It wasn't an excuse, but it was an explanation. She didn't know what our mother was really doing. She couldn't have known. We talked for 3 hours that night, not about the money or the legal case or our mother's fate. We talked about our childhood, about memories that looked different now that we understood the truth, about the ways our mother had kept us apart, had turned us into strangers who happened to share blood. It wasn't instant reconciliation. Too much had happened for that. Too many years of distance and misunderstanding. But it was a beginning. Two sisters learning to see each other clearly for the first time without our mother's distortion standing between us. 8 months after the party, while my mother was awaiting her sentencing hearing, she called me. Her voice was small and broken, nothing like the cold, dismissive tone she had used at the family gathering. She told me she was starting therapy. She was facing her addiction. She never meant for things to go this far. I listened without interrupting, searching her words for something genuine. Part of me wanted desperately to believe that my mother was finally changing, finally becoming the parent I had always needed her to be. Then she continued talking, and my hope crumbled to dust. She explained that she was struggling with rent. Her apartment was so expensive, and with the legal fees and the restitution payments, she was barely surviving. Could I help her just this once? She promised to pay me back when she got on her feet. I recognized the pattern instantly. The same promises that had worked on me for 12 years. The same manipulation dressed in different clothes. But I wasn't the same person anymore. Mom, I said carefully, I hope your treatment helps. I really do. But I can't give you money. That part of our relationship is over. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When my mother spoke again, her voice had changed completely. The broken, vulnerable tone vanished, replaced by something hard and familiar. After everything I did for you, she said, I raised you. I gave you a home. I felt a strange calm settle over me. No, Mom, I replied. I paid for that home. And I paid for your addiction without knowing it. I won't do it again. Her voice rose with anger. You're abandoning your own mother. I took a breath before answering. I'm setting a boundary, I said. There's a difference. Then I hung up the phone. My hands were shaking, but not from guilt, from the unfamiliar sensation of finally standing up for myself. For 36 years, I had bent myself into whatever shape my mother needed. I had sacrificed and accommodated, and hoped that someday it would be enough. Now I understood that it would never be enough because my mother didn't want a daughter. She wanted a resource, and I was done being used. 6 months after I stopped being my mother's safety net, I received a package in the mail. It wasn't from my mother, it was from Emily, and what was inside changed how I understood everything. The package was a small cardboard box, the kind you might use to mail books. Emily had written my address in her neat handwriting, and inside was a short note on top of some old papers. I sat down at my kitchen table in my new condo, the one I had purchased with my settlement money 6 months earlier, and I read what my sister had sent me. The note said she had found these documents while helping sort through things during the house sale. She thought about throwing them away, but decided I deserved to know the truth. She apologized for not seeing it sooner. Beneath the note were printouts of old emails my mother had sent to Aunt Maureen years ago shortly after my father died. My mother had printed them out and saved them for some reason, maybe as a reminder of her own grievances, maybe as justification for the way she treated me. I don't know why she kept them. But Emily found them in a box of old papers, and now they were in my hands. The first email was dated just a few months after the funeral. My mother had written to her sister about me. Jamie is just like him, she wrote. Secretive, untrustworthy. I look at her and see his lies. Every time she walks into a room, I see David. I see everything he hid from me. I can't separate her from what he did. The second email was from about a year later. I know I'm harder on Jamie, my mother admitted. Maybe it's not fair, but I can't help it. She knew about the gambling and said nothing. She was 15 years old enough to understand what she was doing. She chose to protect him instead of telling me. She made her choice, and now she has to live with the consequences. I read those words 3 times. 15 years old. My mother had written that I was 15, but I was actually 16 when I discovered my father's secret. She couldn't even remember my age correctly. She had spent 20 years punishing me, and she didn't even have the basic facts right. But more than that error, what struck me was the coldness in her words. The deliberate decision to blame a teenager for an impossible situation. She hadn't stumbled into treating me badly. She had chosen it. She had written it down, explained her reasoning, and committed to making me pay for my father's sins. I didn't cry when I finished reading. I felt something unexpected wash over me. Relief, not because my mother's words didn't hurt because they did, but because I finally had proof of something I had always sensed but could never confirm. It was never my fault. I was a child trying to protect a father I loved, caught in an impossible situation I didn't understand. My mother made a choice 20 years ago to blame me for my father's mistakes. That was her choice, her failure, not mine. I put the emails back in the box and set it on a shelf in my closet. I didn't need to read them again. I had spent too many years searching for reasons, for explanations, for some way to understand why my mother had never loved me the way she loved Emily. Now I had my answer, and the answer set me free. 14 months after the graduation party, my life looked completely different. I had used my settlement to buy a modest two-bedroom condo in a quiet neighborhood. It was smaller than the house I had paid for all those years, but my name was on the deed. Mine alone. No one could take it from me. No one could claim I had no right to be there. I had been promoted at work to senior project manager, a position that came with more responsibility but also more recognition. My colleagues respected me. My boss valued my contributions. I mattered to the people around me. I had started painting again, a hobby I abandoned years ago when all my extra money went to the family house. I wasn't very good, just simple landscapes and abstract shapes, but the act of creating something for no reason other than my own enjoyment felt revolutionary. I went to therapy now every other week, working through years of being told I wasn't good enough, wasn't doing enough, wasn't worthy of the same love my sister received. My therapist helped me understand that I had spent my whole life trying to earn something that was never actually available to me. My mother's approval was a prize she had decided I could never win. Once I understood that, I stopped competing for it. I wasn't angry anymore. The rage that had burned in me during those first months had faded into something quieter. I wasn't waiting for an apology that would never truly come. I wasn't hoping my mother would wake up one day and realize what she had done. I had simply accepted the truth and moved forward. For the first time in my 37 years, I felt free. My mother had completed her probation requirements. 18 months of check-ins, community service hours, mandatory therapy sessions for her gambling addiction. The felony conviction remained on her record and would stay there forever. She worked part-time at a discount store, now one of the few places willing to hire someone with a fraud conviction. She lived in that small studio apartment, paying her Chapter 13 bankruptcy obligations every month. Most of her income went to the payment plan that would continue for another 3.5 years. She had sent me 3 letters since her sentencing. The first was full of justifications, explaining why she did what she did, how the gambling wasn't really her fault, how I never understood the pressure she was under. I read it once and threw it away. The second letter acknowledged that mistakes were made using that passive language that avoids actual accountability. I threw that one away too. The third letter arrived about a year after the party, after she had been in mandated therapy for several months. That one was different. She wrote that the court made her go to therapy, and she went because she had to. But somewhere along the way, she started actually listening. She wrote that she blamed me for my father's secrets because blaming me was easier than dealing with her own grief. She said it wasn't fair. She didn't expect me to forgive her. She just wanted me to know that she finally understood what she did. I read that letter 3 times. I didn't respond. Maybe someday I would. Maybe not, but I kept it. It was the first honest thing my mother had written in 20 years. Aunt Maureen visited every few weeks now. She had become the mother figure I never had, the family member who saw me clearly and loved me anyway. Emily was coming for dinner this weekend. We were planning a road trip together, something we had never done as children, something our mother's manipulation had made impossible. The sisters were building something new, free from Linda's shadow. It wasn't the relationship we should have had all along, but it was real, and it was ours. I stood on my balcony watching the sunset, thinking about the pattern that nearly destroyed my family, my father's hidden addiction, my mother's hidden addiction. The lies that compounded across 20 years, poisoning everything they touched. I was supposed to inherit that pattern. The secrecy, the denial, the inability to face hard truths. Instead, I broke it. Not by being perfect, not by forgiving everything, but by choosing honesty over comfortable lies. By setting boundaries instead of enabling, by finally believing I deserved better than crumbs of conditional love. That was my real victory. Not the money, not the condo, freedom from a cycle I refused to repeat. People ask me if I regret exposing my mother, if I feel guilty for destroying the family. I tell them I didn't destroy anything. I just stopped pretending the destruction wasn't already there. For 20 years, my mother made me feel invisible, used me, lied to me. Now I finally see myself clearly. And sometimes that's the only closure you need. Some families are bound by love. Others are bound by secrets, debts, and the people willing to pay for them. I spent 12 years paying my mother's bills and my father's debts I didn't even know existed. Now I'm finally free, not because I got revenge, not because I got an apology, but because I stopped waiting for permission to matter. Jamie's story is one that many of you listening right now might recognize in some form. Maybe not the exact details, but the feelings. The sense of being taken for granted by the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. The exhaustion of giving everything you have and still being told it's not enough. The painful realization that some family members see you not as a person to be cherished, but as a resource to be used. If any part of this story resonated with you, I want you to know that you are not alone, and there are important lessons we can all take away from what Jamie experienced. The first lesson is about protecting yourself even within your own family. Jamie trusted her mother completely. She sent money every month for 12 years without verifying that it was being used as promised. She believed that family didn't need contracts or documentation. That trust cost her hundreds of thousands of dollars and years of emotional pain. The truth is, love and trust are beautiful things, but they should never require you to abandon common sense. If you are ever providing significant financial support to a family member, please protect yourself. Keep records of every payment. Get agreements in writing. Anyone who truly loves you will not be offended by your desire for clarity. Anyone who refuses to put promises in writing is someone whose promises you should question. The second lesson is about recognizing the difference between helping and enabling. Jamie thought she was helping her mother maintain a home. In reality, she was enabling a gambling addiction that her mother refused to acknowledge. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for someone is to stop rescuing them from the consequences of their own choices. Enabling destructive behavior doesn't help anyone. It just prolongs the pain and delays the moment when the person must finally face reality. The third lesson is about setting boundaries. For most of her life, Jamie believed that being a good daughter meant sacrificing her own needs and accepting mistreatment without complaint. Many of us were raised to believe that setting boundaries is selfish or unloving. But Jamie's story shows us the opposite is true. Setting boundaries is not about punishing others. It's about recognizing your own value and refusing to let others treat you as less than you deserve. When Jamie finally told her mother she would not give her any more money, she wasn't being cruel. She was being healthy. She was breaking a pattern that had controlled her entire adult life. The fourth lesson is about the possibility of healing. Jamie's story doesn't end with revenge or bitterness. It ends with freedom. She built a new relationship with her sister based on honesty. She created a life that belonged to her. She found peace not by getting an apology, but by letting go of her need for one. You cannot control whether the people who hurt you will ever acknowledge what they did, but you can control whether you allow their actions to define the rest of your life. Healing is possible. New chapters can begin at any age. If this story touched your heart, I would love to hear from you. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever dealt with a family member who took advantage of your generosity? How did you handle it? What advice would you give to others in similar situations? Your stories could help someone else who is struggling right now and needs to know they are not alone. And if you enjoyed this video and want to hear more stories like Jamie's, please consider subscribing to our channel and clicking the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. We share new stories every week about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges and reclaiming their lives. Your support means everything to us. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of this community, and remember, you deserve to be valued, respected, and loved for who you are, not for what you can provide. Never let anyone make you feel invisible.